Hello and welcome to 10 Facts about Ancient Egypt. 1. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus claimed that the pyramids were built by thousands of slaves. However, archaeologists have found evidence that the pyramids were built by a paid workforce. There were around 20,000 workers among skilled laborers and temporary workforce. They often came from poor families and worked for decades to complete a pyramid. The workers were housed near the building site and were paid with food, drinks, and other supplies. This doesn't mean that building the pyramids was an easy job. By studying the skeletons of those workers, archaeologists found that accidents weren't uncommon. They would receive emergency treatment for their injuries and continue to work. Many of the skeletons showed signs of arthritis, which shows us how physically demanding their job was. So demanding that the average life expectancy was between 30 and 35 years of age. 2. Scribes rarely wrote in hieroglyphs. Egyptian hieroglyphs are one of the most famous and recognizable aspects of ancient Egypt. Although many people would assume that hieroglyphs were the primary form of writing used in ancient Egypt, they reserved it mainly to write on the walls of temples, tombs, and other important monuments. Hieroglyphic was a very complex form of writing, and literacy rates were very low. One of the few groups of people that were trained in writing were scribes, which was one of the most prestigious careers you could have in ancient Egypt. Scribes were trained to read and write in hieroglyphs, but since it was so time-consuming, they used a shorter writing system known as hieratic. This was the writing system scribes used for administrative and legal documents, religious texts, and letters. Later, other writing systems, first Demotic and then Coptic of Greek influence, would become the system of choice for writing documents. The Rosetta Stone, for example, was written in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. 3. Women could also be pharaohs. Most pharaohs were men, and indeed that was the norm in ancient Egypt. However, that wasn't always the case. Perhaps the most famous pharaoh to ever rule Egypt was Cleopatra, but a few women had the role of pharaoh before her. One of the most successful female pharaohs was Hatshepsut. After the death of her husband Thutmose II in 1479 BCE, she became regent, since the successor to the throne, her stepson, was still a child. However, after a few years, she took the throne and declared herself pharaoh. Although her ascension to the throne caused some controversy at the time, her reign saw great building projects and the expansion of trade routes. Other female pharaohs include Tautret and Sobekneferu. 4. Egyptian women had the same legal rights as men. When we look at major civilizations from the ancient world, ancient Egypt was by far the best place to be if you were a woman. While in most civilizations women had very few rights or no rights at all, in ancient Egypt they had almost the same rights as their male counterparts. Women could choose who they married and, if they wanted to divorce, could represent themselves in court, own and manage properties, and have jobs, which included being scribes, priests, doctors, brewers, and other regular jobs. However, that doesn't mean that women were seen as equal to men. Generally, men held positions of authority and were seen as the head of the household, while women usually worked as cooks, weavers, and managed the house. A clear example of this distinction is how, over the thousands of years of ancient Egyptian history, there were only a handful of female pharaohs. Still, they were much more advanced when it came to women's rights than any other major civilization of their time. 5. Pets were extremely popular in ancient Egypt. Animals were an important aspect of ancient Egyptian culture and life. Many of their gods and goddesses had an animal form and were associated with at least one animal. The practice of keeping pets was very common. They were even buried or sometimes mummified after their death. One of the most popular animals that was kept as a pet was the cat, associated with the goddess Bastet. Dogs were also very common and were used for hunting in some cases. Egyptians also kept what would be considered more exotic animals as pets. These included falcons, hawks, lions, gazelles, hippos, and baboons. These animals were kept as pets not only for the divine connection, but also as a symbol of power. Since they were harder to maintain, they were often kept by pharaohs and members of the elite. 6. Ancient Egyptians had the most advanced medicine of its time. Medicine in ancient Egypt was quite advanced for its time. Doctors received special training and were highly respected not only in Egypt but also in neighboring civilizations. Known areas of specialization included ophthalmology, gastroenterology, proctology, and dentistry. They were able to identify different types of heart disease, skin problems, dental problems, diseases related to the eyes, intestinal diseases, mental illnesses, diseases caused by parasites, and were able to perform simple, non-invasive surgeries. For treatments, they used natural medicine such as herbs and spices, incantations, and spells. Since magic and the belief in the supernatural was an essential part of their culture and just another aspect of life, they believed that certain illnesses were in part caused by evil spirits or as a punishment from a god. The usage of herbs was also common. Some ancient Egyptian papyri describe the medicinal use of cannabis, with it being prescribed for cancer patients. When it came to performing surgeries, ancient Egyptians understood the importance of cleanliness. The mortality rate following medical procedures was probably less than that of any European hospital in the Christian era up until the mid-20th century. And personal cleanliness and the sterilization of instruments became common practice. 7. The ancient Egyptians signed the earliest peace treaty known in history. For over 2 centuries, Egyptians and Hittites waged war against each other. This culminated in the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, where Egyptian forces led by Ramses II faced the Hittites led by Muwatalli II. Both sides suffered heavy losses and were unable to claim a decisive victory. The conflict continued for several years, until in 1258 BCE, when the peace treaty was signed. By that time, both sides started to face ever-growing threats from other civilizations, the Egyptians by the Sea People and the Hittites by the Assyrians. In the following decades, Egyptians and Hittites maintained a friendly relationship that was mutually beneficial and lasted until the fall of the Hittite Empire almost a century later. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty is considered to be the first ever peace treaty in history. 8. Egyptian workers organized labor strikes. In the late 12th century BCE, during the reign of Ramses III, considered to be the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Egypt suffered a number of losses against the Sea People, from which their economy never fully recovered. One of the consequences was the delay in the payment of tomb workers and artisans at Set Mat, later known as the El Medina, who worked on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. 1 month after waiting 18 days for their payment, workers organized a sit-in and refused to work until they were paid, marking the first ever strike in recorded history. The strikes lasted for several months, with workers often receiving late payments. In the following decades and centuries, a number of strikes continued to be recorded in ancient Egypt. 9. Cleopatra was ethnically Greek. Even though she is one of the most well-known figures of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra was ethnically Greek. She was a descendant of Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great and founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled over Egypt after it was conquered by Alexander the Great. The rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty saw themselves as Greek and never even bothered to learn the native Egyptian language. As a matter of fact, Cleopatra was the first pharaoh of her dynasty to be fluent in the Egyptian language and to embrace the local customs. She was a powerful queen, but her reign was marked by a series of wars and much turmoil, which culminated in the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE. 10. The Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, contrary to what the name may suggest, isn't a uniform version of a book. It is actually a manual designed to help an individual reach the afterlife, and each manual was unique and made specifically for the deceased person. Before writing the manual, the scribe would need to know what kind of life the person had lived, to then create a manual with instructions of what that individual would face on their journey to the afterlife, including a number of spells. Since the early days of the Old Kingdom, these manuals were made only for members of the royal family. However, centuries later, during the New Kingdom, scribes started to make versions of the book with different options of spells that the customer could choose, creating more affordable options. One of the most famous and well-known spells was Spell 125, which describes the moments that the heart of the deceased is weighted in the presence of the god Osiris in the Hall of Truth. And for the soul to gain access to paradise, the heart must weigh less than a feather. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.